So during our Lent series on mental health, I wanted to make sure to talk about suicide at some point. And today's that day. Now, I don't mean to build myself up too much, but I think just this sermon can save lives. And I say that because it has been proven that simply talking about suicide saves lives. And my hope today is that simply by talking about suicide here, we feel more comfortable talking about it at home. Saving lives often seems like this big heroic thing out of comic books and movies. But in this case, we will simply save lives through conversations and creating an environment where we can freely talk about suicide. There's certainly more than we can do, but just talking about it openly is a major step. The fact of the matter is that when we don't talk about something, that often gives it power. When there are things we are uncomfortable talking about, that means we're on our own to figure them out. In the case of suicide, that's very much deadly. Or if we can find people to talk about taboo things, they're often on the fringes of society, which is not always the healthiest thing either. A few examples of this effect. It happened with homosexuality. Because society would not openly talk about homosexuality in an encouraging way, it pushed the conversation underground. Just because we wouldn't talk about the natural urges, thoughts, attractions that people were having doesn't mean we don't have them anymore. So people went looking for conversation and support in places where people were willing to have that conversation. And on the one hand, thank God that a supportive community was formed. But on the other hand, there are challenges with a community whose social glue is sexuality, and we talk about those. Would it not have been much healthier for everybody to just not let this conversation unfold freely and out in the open? And while we're talking about sexuality, let's talk about sex itself. I obviously wasn't around at the time, but it appears to me that prior to a certain date, people just didn't talk openly about sex. And if you did, you probably had to leave, quote-unquote, polite society. So by not talking about sex, we pushed it to the fringes and created other cultures. And then, since the sexual revolution of the 60s, we kind of idolized sex. We've overcorrected. But now we realize how little we knew and how harmful that lack of knowledge could be. Would it not have been better to simply talk openly about it? Another example. The internet has been an interesting experience in terms of what we do or don't talk about. And it's causing a revolution of its own that we're seeing sort of come out in various ways. Suddenly, anyone, anywhere in the world can find their tribe, and they can even do it anonymously. With 8 billion people in the world and no fear of local social repercussions, you can easily find a group with the same interests, no matter how obscure. And that group will have some type of critical mass. It doesn't matter whether you're interested in ships and bottles or white supremacy. There's a group for you. If we don't have conversations openly and honestly, everyone now knows that they can go onto the internet and find people who will support them. I often hear the complaint that young people are constantly on their phones, and I have to ask, is it because they're addicted to the technology, Or is it because they're looking for a more accepting and supportive community than the people they happen to currently be with? It doesn't take much to drive people away today. It's so easy to drive conversations underground today because the options for elsewhere are there. So they pop up in other less healthy places. So my point is that just because we don't openly talk about things doesn't mean they're not there. And the longer we go, let's try that again. Oh, I see what happened. Here I'm talking about how great technology is. Or how interesting technology is, anyway. Anyway, my point is that just because we don't openly talk about things doesn't mean they're not there. And the longer we go without talking about them, or even being mildly hostile to them, the harder the conversation when it breaks out into the open. I truly believe that a lot of the social problems we're facing right now are simply because we've shut the conversations down in the past, or being hostile. Instead of having conversations in slow, consistent, measured ways, we're avoiding them, and then suddenly having to deal with them all at once. Talking openly and non-judgmentally about anything and everything is extremely important. Suicide happens when someone is convinced there are no more options left. It does sound like there are some extreme cases when mental illness leads to a desire for self-harm, but the clear majority are by far people who just don't see any more options. And even then, when I wonder, and I'm not a mental health professional, but when I wonder how it must feel to have that kind of extreme mental illness, I suspect there has to be some sense of hopelessness that drives you to action. But you know what fights that sense of hopelessness? Knowing that you're not alone. Knowing that you're loved. Knowing that you have options and people willing to help you figure those options out. For the last 2 weeks, we've talked about self-actualization and call. On the one hand, we've recognized that we cannot rely on sort of external norms for our sense of self-worth. The world is a complicated place. People are complicated creatures. We each experience the world differently. Some of us are more or less mentally healthy, and so we need to be self-actualized to find our sense of value and motivation from something more stable than the complicated culture around us. And another key to mental health is to have that sense of purpose and sense that you're giving back to the community. A sense of call is very much about those things, about contributing to the community and having a sense of purpose. It also gives you that stable thing in which to find your sense of value and motivation that doesn't necessarily depend on the varied and inconsistent expectations of those around us. It seems to me that if someone is feeling the need to end their life, then they no longer have that sense of calling. In fact, it may even be the opposite, not just that the thread has been lost, but the growing conviction that there's no thread at all. Now, I need to name the fact that the church has not traditionally been kind when it comes to suicide. I'm not a church historian, and so I want to be careful about broad strokes. I suspect there were indeed people and communities through our 2,000-year history who were compassionate and who understood. But we do not have a good reputation when it comes to the topic of suicide. And this makes a little sense when put in context, but it no longer applies today. Mostly it was probably a preventative measure. Today, salvation is more of a personal, theological journey, and many don't believe in it at all. But through most of church history, if the church said you would not be saved if you ended your life, then people were certainly more inclined to listen. It was preventative. We also, and rightly, have serious discomfort with ending someone's life, be it someone else's or our own. And the way that the church would have understood mental health until the last century was extremely different than we do today. Sins of the fathers, demons, etc. But today we do understand. There's no excuse anymore. God has revealed information to us through doctors and scientists and research that has allowed us to grow in our understanding and see clearly the sins of our past. And our treatment of suicide is certainly a sin of our past. Now, a hobby horse of mine is how often we focus on John 3:16 to the exclusion of the surrounding verses. In fact, it's amazing how much we can twist even the meaning of that one loving verse. For God so loved the... Bert? For God so loved the... He's nodding at me. What's the word? Logos? Cosmos. Bert's always telling me, for God so loved the world. Greek word is cosmos. What does that world mean here? Often we think world means humans for some reason. I've had people get downright upset at me for suggesting otherwise. But the word in the original Greek is cosmos. It means a world in an expansive way. It's not just us. So cosmos, this John 3:16, it's an expansive statement on love. And we understand that. But even with that understanding, our nature is to sort of try to put limits on it. The following verse, I think, is actually the most important reminder. If we talk about John 3:16, we always need to talk about John 3:17. Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Those who know this chapter well may point out that there is a lot of in and out language here. Jesus talks about this sense that we all love darkness and we don't have to face our blemishes if we're in the dark. So he comes and sheds light. As he comes and sheds light, there will be those who are able to be vulnerable and embrace the light, or those who can't be vulnerable and thus embrace the dark. I do think this is an important understanding for the larger gospel message, and our world clearly points to that wisdom. Some of us cannot stand to have our vulnerabilities exposed. Others don't mind at all. Of course, most of us are probably on some kind of spectrum in between. But as Jesus describes this dynamic, he reminds us that he's not here to draw lines between who's in and who's out. God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world. It is easy to view this as in and out language, but that reminder is always present that that's not what it's about. He's describing an important dynamic, not drawing a line. And while Jesus does describe this dynamic, the bottom line is love. Perhaps we struggle with mental health because we're afraid to show our vulnerabilities. I recently heard a woman with a disability describe her disability as freeing. It's immediately clear that her body is not normal, and so she cannot be tied to normal. She's forced to be vulnerable, and she found that immensely freeing. The darkness was not an option for her in that respect. That's gospel to me. Maybe the pain we feel is from clinging to the darkness because we're afraid to show anything but strength. And maybe we don't have that strength. But that assurance of love and support, that's what allows us to be vulnerable. Our job as Christians thinking about suicide and mental health is to create a world where people can be free to be vulnerable. A world where if you are considering ending your life, you can talk about it with someone around you openly and freely. Just creating that environment will help immensely, because it will be more obvious that just because you don't have that sense of call or self-actualization or whatever doesn't mean others feel the same way. We can help each other. We can help those who don't see any other path to realize there is always a path, whether it's obvious or not. Really hoping, as I had said this, to have that picture up as a reminder that sometimes the greatest possibilities can make us feel the most alone. But anyway, technology. I think the biggest sin around suicide is the fact that we saw it as an individual sin. When the world was too much to bear, we put that on the individual that was already struggling with the burdens of life. But suicide, as much as I can think of it, is a communal sin. When someone, my friend told me, people don't commit suicide. They end their life. And I said, I haven't got that anywhere in my sermon, and here it is. When someone chooses to end their life, it is because we have not created an environment that they can continue living in. That is a tall order, and one that we have, that we will likely never be entirely successful in. We're broken people. The world is simply too complicated, and we're not strong enough. But with God's grace, we are promised that it is possible. And so let's make sure we carry this burden together. Let's start talking about it. Amen.